The mahogany doors of the Sterling estate didn't creak. They groaned, as if the very wood remembered the sins committed within these walls. Elena stood on the threshold, her breath hitching in the crisp autumn air. 18 years ago, she had been shoved out of these same doors with nothing but a plastic trash bag and a bruised heart. Today, she wasn't wearing a tattered coat. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than her stepmother's monthly vanity budget. In her hand was a leather briefcase, and inside it was a legal storm that would level the family empire to the ground. As she stepped into the foyer, the scent of expensive lilies hit her, a smell that used to mean stay quiet. Her stepmother, Beatrice, descended the grand staircase, her face a mask of practiced elegance that quickly cracked into confusion. "Can I help you?" Beatrice asked, her voice like ice scraping against glass. "The estate isn't open for tours, and we certainly didn't call for a clerk." Elena looked up, her eyes hard and reflective like polished flint. "I'm not here for a tour, Beatrice, and I'm certainly not a clerk. I'm the ghost you thought you buried in the rain 18 years ago. My name is Elena Sterling, and I've come to take back what you stole." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock, a countdown to a reckoning nearly 2 decades in the making. The year was 2008. 7-year-old Elena sat on the edge of her bed, clutching a frayed stuffed rabbit named Barnaby. Outside, the sky was bruised purple with an approaching storm. Downstairs, the house was screaming. Not the people. The house itself seemed to vibrate with the tension of her father's absence. Her father, Thomas Sterling, had been gone for 3 days on a business trip that felt like an eternity. Since her mother had passed away 2 years prior, Thomas was Elena's only shield. But recently, that shield had grown thin. Then came Beatrice. Beatrice had entered their lives like a summer breeze that quickly turned into a gale. She was beautiful, yes, but her smiles never reached her eyes when Thomas wasn't looking. To Thomas, she was a grace. To Elena, she was a predator. "Elena, get down here now!" The voice boomed up the stairs, sharp and devoid of any maternal warmth. Elena scurried down, her small socks sliding on the polished hardwood. Beatrice stood in the kitchen, a glass of red wine in one hand and a legal document in the other. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, but her eyes were wild. "Your father isn't coming back tonight," Beatrice said, her voice eerily calm. "In fact, he might not be coming back for a very long time. There was an accident, a misunderstanding with the authorities." "Is Daddy okay?" Elena's lip trembled. Beatrice didn't answer. Instead, she walked over to the mudroom and tossed a black plastic bag at Elena's feet. "I've realized something, Elena. This house is too big for memories that don't serve me, and you are a very loud memory." "I don't understand," Elena whispered. "It's simple. You aren't mine. You were a package deal I no longer wish to subscribe to. Your father's assets are being frozen, and I need to consolidate. Keeping a child who reminds everyone of his first wife is bad for my image." Beatrice grabbed Elena by the arm. Her grip was like a vice. She dragged the 7-year-old toward the side door. The wind was already howling, whipping the branches of the ancient oaks against the siding. "You can't do this. Daddy will be mad," Elena cried out, the first tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. Daddy isn't here to save you," Beatrice hissed, leaning down until her face was inches from Elena's. "And if you ever try to come back, I'll tell the police your father left because of you. I'll tell them you're the reason he's in trouble. Now go, find a different story to live in." With a shove that sent Elena sprawling onto the wet gravel of the driveway, the door slammed shut. The bolt clicked, the porch light flickered once and then died, leaving the little girl in total darkness. Elena stood up, shivering. She looked at the towering mansion. She could see Beatrice's silhouette through the frosted glass of the door, watching her. Elena didn't cry then. She realized with a clarity far beyond her years that the house wasn't a home anymore. It was a fortress, and she had just been exiled. She turned her back on the lights of the Sterling estate and began to walk down the long, winding driveway toward the main road, the plastic bag dragging behind her like a heavy shadow. The rain didn't just fall, it punished. For hours, Elena walked along the shoulder of the highway, the plastic bag growing heavier as it filled with rainwater. Every pair of headlights that approached felt like a monster's eyes, and every time she dove into the tall, wet grass of the ditch to hide. Beatrice's parting threat echoed in her ears. "I'll tell the police your father left because of you." At 7 years old, guilt is a physical weight. Elena truly believed that if she were found, she would be the reason her father never came home. By dawn, she had reached the outskirts of a neighboring town. Her feet blistered and her spirit fractured. She collapsed on a wooden bench outside a closed bus station. That was where Martha found her. Martha was a woman whose face was etched with the kind of wrinkles that only come from a lifetime of hard work and even harder kindness. She was opening the small station cafe when she saw the shivering bundle of wet clothes. "Good heavens, child," Martha whispered, dropping her keys. Elena didn't speak. She couldn't. Her jaw was locked tight from the cold. Martha didn't ask for a name or an address right away. She wrapped Elena in a thick wool blanket that smelled of cinnamon and old books and sat her by a radiator. For the next week, Elena lived in the back room of Martha's modest apartment above the station. Martha called the local shelters and the police, but back at the Sterling estate, Beatrice had played her hand perfectly. She had filed a report stating that Elena had been picked up by a distant relative from her mother's side following Thomas's legal disappearance. In the chaos of a high society scandal involving Thomas Sterling's sudden arrest for embezzlement, a missing child was easily swept under the rug of bureaucracy. "They aren't looking for you, honey," Martha said one evening, her voice heavy with a truth she hated to deliver. She had seen the news. Thomas Sterling had been sentenced to 15 years in a federal facility. The assets were tied up, and Beatrice was already liquidating the secondary properties. Elena looked up from her bowl of soup. "I don't have a relative, Martha. It's just me." "Then it's just us," Martha replied firmly. Martha was a widow with no children of her own. She saw in Elena a spark that the rain hadn't been able to douse. She moved Elena 2 towns over, changed her last name to Vance, and enrolled her in a small public school. To the world, Elena Sterling was a footnote in a tragic rich man's downfall. To the neighborhood, Elena Vance was the quiet girl who spent every lunch hour in the library. Reading law books she was far too young to understand. "Why are you reading about contracts, Elle?" Martha asked one night, seeing the 10-year-old hovering over a thick tome. Elena's eyes were cold, reflecting the lamp's glow. "Because Beatrice used a piece of paper to take my house. I'm going to find the piece of paper that takes it back." As the years bled into a decade, the trauma of that night didn't fade. It calcified into a diamond-hard ambition. Elena worked 3 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA. She didn't go to parties. She didn't have a boyfriend. Every dollar was saved, and every minute was spent studying the mechanics of inheritance, corporate fraud, and property law. She watched from afar as Beatrice turned the Sterling estate into a playground for the elite. Beatrice had remarried a wealthy developer named Julian Vane, doubling her influence. They were the power couple of the state, appearing on the covers of lifestyle magazines, smiling in front of the very fireplace where Elena's mother used to read her stories. The night Elena received her acceptance letter to Harvard Law, she didn't celebrate with champagne. She walked to the bathroom, looked at her reflection, and cut her long hair into a sharp professional bob. "It's time, Martha," she said, holding the letter. "You're going to be a lion, aren't you?" Martha asked, her eyes misting with pride. "No," Elena replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "Lions are loud. I'm going to be a ghost that finally learns how to haunt." Harvard was not a place of learning for Elena. It was a training ground. While her peers debated the philosophy of justice over expensive lattes, Elena sat in the back of the lecture halls, her eyes fixed on the mechanics of destruction. She didn't want to build a career. She wanted to build a weapon. She specialized in forensic accounting and estate law. She spent her nights in the windowless basement of the law library, digging through digitized public records from 18 years ago. She tracked every shell company Beatrice had formed, every offshore account, and every charity that seemed to exist only on paper. "You're obsessed, Elena," her only friend Sarah whispered one night. "You haven't slept in 36 hours. Who is this B. Vane you keep cross-referencing?" Elena didn't look up from the spreadsheet. "A thief who thinks she's a queen." By the time Elena passed the bar exam with one of the highest scores in the state, she was no longer the shivering girl from the bus station. She was a surgical instrument of the law. She took a junior position at a prestigious firm in the city, the very firm that used to represent her father. She spent 2 years working quietly, rising through the ranks and gathering the final pieces of her puzzle. She discovered that her father, Thomas Sterling, hadn't just disappeared into a legal black hole. He had died in a minimum security prison 5 years into his sentence, of a broken heart, the record said, though Elena knew it was the weight of Beatrice's betrayal. But there was a discrepancy, a tiny flickering light in a sea of dark data. A trust fund had been established by Thomas just months before his arrest. It wasn't in Elena's name. Beatrice would have found that. It was under a string of numbers that matched the coordinates of Elena's mother's favorite rose garden. The trust was dormant, but it held the controlling interest in the Sterling estate's land. Beatrice had been living in a house built on ground she didn't technically own. The day Elena resigned from her firm, her boss was stunned. "You're on the partner track, Elena. Why leave now?" "I have a private client," Elena said, clicking her briefcase shut. "A very old friend who has been waiting 18 years for a meeting." She drove back to her hometown in a sleek black sedan. She didn't go to the cemetery first. She didn't go to see Martha. She drove straight to the gates of the Sterling estate. The gates were taller now, topped with wrought iron spikes, but they felt smaller to Elena. She pressed the intercom. "Yes?" a bored voice crackled. "I'm here to serve papers to Beatrice Vane regarding the unlawful occupation of the Sterling grounds," Elena said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "Who is this?" "Tell her," Elena leaned into the microphone, "that the package deal has returned for a refund." The gates hummed and slowly swung open. As Elena drove up the long, winding driveway, the same one she had walked down in the rain as a child, she looked at her hands on the steering wheel. They weren't shaking. For the first time in 18 years, the cold inside her had finally matched the world outside. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the gravel like a ticking clock. Beatrice was waiting on the porch, draped in silk, looking annoyed rather than afraid. "I don't know who you're pretending to be," Beatrice said as Elena approached, "but my lawyers will have you arrested for harassment before the sun sets." Elena stopped 3 feet away. She pulled a single photograph from her pocket, a picture of a 7-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit, taken the day before the world ended. "The sun has already set on you, Beatrice," Elena said. "I'm not here to harass you. I'm here to evict you." Beatrice didn't look at the photograph. She didn't even glance at the little girl's face. She stared at Elena's eyes, trying to find a flicker of the weakness she remembered, but there was nothing but a cold, predatory stillness. "Elena," Beatrice whispered, the name tasting like ash. Then her face hardened, the shock replaced by a jagged, defensive sneer. "You should have stayed dead, or lost, or whatever gutter you crawled into." "I didn't crawl, Beatrice. I climbed," Elena replied, stepping closer. "And while you were busy spending my father's money on Botox and bad art, I was learning exactly how you stole it." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Stole? I was his wife. I inherited this estate legally when he was convicted of fraud. The courts gave me everything. You were nothing but a liability your father forgot to mention in his will." "That's where you're wrong," Elena said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a blue-bound folder. "My father didn't forget me. He feared you. He knew that if he left anything directly to me, you'd find a way to bleed it dry or make me disappear. So he didn't leave me money. He left me a technicality." Elena flipped to a highlighted page. "In 1998, when my father bought this land, he placed the deed into a private environmental land trust. The house belongs to the Sterling Corporation, which you seized, but the land it sits on, that belongs to the trust, and the trust is activated by a specific biological key upon the death of the grantor." Beatrice's hand went to her throat. "What are you talking about?" "I am the biological key, Beatrice. I've already submitted my DNA to the trust executors. As of 9 a.m. this morning, I am the sole owner of every square inch of dirt beneath your expensive heels. You are currently trespassing on my property." The silence in the foyer was deafening. Beatrice's husband, Julian Vane, appeared at the top of the stairs, looking confused. "Beatrice, who is this woman? Why is she shouting about land?" "She's nobody, Julian," Beatrice snapped, her voice cracking. She turned back to Elena, her eyes filled with a desperate fire. "You think you can just walk back here after 2 decades and ruin me? I have the best legal team in the state. I'll tie you up in litigation until you're old and gray." "I counted on that," Elena said with a faint, chilling smile. "Which is why I didn't come alone." 2 black SUVs pulled into the driveway, stopping right behind Elena's car. Men in suits stepped out, carrying equipment and more folders. "Who are they?" Julian shouted, descending the stairs quickly. "Forensic auditors and a private security detail." "And, Elena said. "Since I own the land, I am exercising my right to conduct a full environmental and structural audit. That includes the invisible safe in the basement that my father installed for his ledgers, the one you told the police didn't exist." Beatrice turned pale. The practiced elegance of her life was peeling away like cheap wallpaper in a flood. "You can't go in there. I'll call the police." "Please do," Elena said, stepping aside to let her team pass. "I'd love to show them the discrepancy between the embezzled funds my father supposedly took and the offshore accounts that opened in your maiden name just 3 weeks before his arrest. It's funny how a paper trail never truly ends, Beatrice. It just waits for someone who knows how to read it." As the auditors pushed past Beatrice into the house, Elena leaned in close to her stepmother's ear. 18 years ago, it was raining. Tonight, it's perfectly clear. I want you to see everything as it falls apart. Beatrice looked at her husband, then at the strangers invading her home, and finally back at Elena. For the first time, she saw not a girl she had discarded, but a hunter who had finally cornered its prey. As the auditors began their work, the Sterling estate transformed from a luxury sanctuary into a crime scene. Elena sat in the high-backed velvet chair in the library, the very chair her father used to sit in, while Beatrice paced the floor like a caged animal. Julian, realizing the severity of the situation, was frantically whispering into his phone in the hallway. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Beatrice spat, stopping in front of Elena. "You think a few dusty files and a land trust make you the queen of this hill. But you have no idea how deep my roots go in this town." Elena didn't blink. She was watching a technician run a thermal scanner over the wood-paneled walls. "Roots rot, Beatrice, especially when they're fed on poison." "I did what I had to do," Beatrice shouted, her composure finally shattering. "Your father was a weak man. He was going to lose everything anyway. I just redirected the fall." "You framed him," Elena corrected, her voice a low, vibrating hum of steel. "You funneled the company's capital into accounts he didn't know existed, then tipped off the SEC. You didn't just redirect the fall, you pushed him off the cliff and held me over the edge to make sure he wouldn't scream." A sharp click echoed from the corner of the room. The technician had found it, the seam in the paneling. With a firm push, a section of the wall popped open, revealing a small, keypad-protected vault. Beatrice's breath hitched. "That's private property. You have no right." "Actually," Elena stood up, smoothing her jacket, "as the owner of the land and the successor to the Sterling legacy, any fixtures not specifically listed in the 2008 bankruptcy disclosure belong to the estate. And since you claimed this vault didn't exist in your sworn testimony back then, it's legally found property. And I'm the one who found it." The technician looked at Elena. "It's a biometric lock, ma'am. Older model. Needs a fingerprint or a code." Elena walked over to the vault. She remembered her father's voice, a memory buried under years of survival. "Elena, if you ever lose your way, remember the day the roses first bloomed." She typed in 6 digits, the date of her mother's birthday. The vault groaned and swung open. Inside weren't stacks of cash or gold bars. It was a single leather-bound ledger and a series of microcassettes. Beatrice lunged forward, her nails clawing at the air, but Elena's security detail stepped in her way. "Julian, do something!" Beatrice screamed. Julian appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. "I can't, Beatrice. I just spoke to the firm. They looked up the trust Elena mentioned. It's ironclad. If we interfere with her audit, we're looking at felony obstruction. We have to let this play out." Elena picked up the ledger. She flipped through the pages, seeing her father's precise, elegant handwriting. He had kept a parallel record. He knew Beatrice was skimming. He had been documenting her theft for months before his arrest, but he had been too late to save himself. But there was something else. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a sealed envelope with a single word written on it. Elena. Her heart, which she had kept frozen for 18 years, gave a painful thud. She didn't open it, not yet. She turned to Beatrice, who was now trembling, her face a pale mask of terror. "You thought he died with nothing," Elena said, holding the ledger up. "But he left me the one thing you can't buy with stolen money: evidence." "It's been 18 years, Beatrice shrieked. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply to capital fraud involving interstate commerce or the tampering of federal evidence," Elena finished for her. "I've spent 5 years studying your specific brand of evil, Beatrice. I didn't just come here to take the house. I came here to make sure you never have a roof over your head again." As Elena turned to leave the room, she heard a faint, high-pitched whistling sound. She stopped. It was coming from the vents. "What is that?" Julian asked, looking up at the ceiling. "The sound of the truth leaking out," Elena said. "But we're just getting started. This house has a lot of secrets, Beatrice, and I'm going to find every single one of them." The ledger felt like a lead weight in Elena's hands. While the auditors systematically dismantled the library, Elena stepped out onto the wide wraparound porch. The night air was biting, a reminder of the cold gravel she had once been forced to call a bed. Behind her, she could hear Beatrice's frantic voice rising and falling, a symphony of desperation. Julian was no longer trying to defend her. He was already on the phone with his own lawyers, likely negotiating a divorce to distance himself from the impending wreckage. Elena sat on the porch swing and finally looked at the envelope. Her name, written in her father's hand, seemed to vibrate on the paper. With trembling fingers, she slid a silver letter opener through the seal. Inside was a single key and a letter dated 2 weeks before Thomas Sterling's arrest. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, it means the storm I feared has finally broken. I have failed you as a father by allowing a wolf into our home. I saw the beauty in Beatrice, but I was blind to the darkness behind it until she had already woven her web around my business. I know what she plans to do. She thinks she has covered her tracks, but she forgot that a builder always knows where the foundations are weak. The key enclosed belongs to a safety deposit box in a small bank in Vermont, a place Beatrice has never visited. Inside is the final piece of the puzzle, the recordings of her and her real partner." Elena froze. Partner? She had always assumed Beatrice acted alone, fueled by her own greed, but the letter implied something much more calculated. "Don't trust the shadows, Elena, even the ones you think you know. I love you more than life itself. Run toward the light, my brave girl." "Elena?" She jumped, tucking the letter into her jacket. It was one of the auditors, a man named Marcus, whom she had worked with for years. He looked troubled. "We found something in the basement," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "It's not just financial records. There's a hidden room behind the wine cellar. It's been wired with an old surveillance system. It looks like someone was being watched for a long time." Elena followed him down the stairs, past the kitchen where she used to sneak cookies, and down into the bowels of the house. The wine cellar was cold and smelled of damp earth. Marcus pointed to a heavy oak shelf that had been swung outward. Behind it was a small, cramped room filled with monitors from the early 2000s. On the desk sat a stack of VHS tapes and a logbook. Elena opened the logbook and felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't a record of business. It was a record of her. October 14th, 2007. Subject, Elena, spoke to the gardener. Potential leak of household tension. Corrective measures required. November 3rd, 2007. Subject showed signs of trauma regarding mother's passing. Use this to isolate from Thomas. Beatrice hadn't just been a gold digger. She had been a psychological architect, mapping out Elena's childhood weaknesses to better manipulate Thomas. "She was studying me," Elena whispered, her voice trembling, like an insect under a glass. "There's more," Marcus said, pointing to a tape that was already in the player. "We played the last few minutes of this one. You need to see it." He hit play. The grainy black and white footage showed the mudroom on the night Elena was kicked out. The timestamp matched. Elena saw her 7-year-old self, small and terrified, being shoved out into the rain. But then, the camera angle shifted. Beatrice wasn't alone in the room. A man stepped into the frame after the door was locked. He was wearing a police uniform. He placed a hand on Beatrice's shoulder, and they shared a look of triumph. Elena's heart stopped. She recognized the man. He wasn't just any officer. He was the man who had eventually become the chief of police in their town, the man who had handled her father's arrest. The partner wasn't a businessman. It was the law itself. This goes higher than just a bitter stepmother, Elena realized, her eyes hardening. This was a conspiracy to dismantle my father's life from the inside and the outside. She turned to Marcus. Secure every tape. If any of these go missing, I'll hold you personally responsible. What are you going to do? Marcus asked. Elena looked at the screen, at the image of the man in uniform. I'm going to stop playing by the rules of a game that was rigged from the start. Beatrice thinks I'm here for the house. She doesn't realize I'm here to burn down the entire city council if I have to. As she climbed the stairs back to the main floor, the emotional girl who had been exiled 18 years ago finally died. In her place was a woman who realized that justice wasn't just about winning a case. It was about total exposure. She walked back into the library where Beatrice was sitting, looking defeated. Who is he, Beatrice? Elena asked, leaning over the desk. Beatrice looked up, her eyes darting. Who? The man in the uniform? The one who watched you throw a child into a storm. Beatrice's face went from pale to ghostly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The clock is ticking, Elena hissed, and I just found the tapes. Beatrice's reaction was more than just fear. It was a total collapse of the soul. She slumped into the chair, her expensive silk dress suddenly looking like a shroud. The name she eventually whispered was one that had commanded respect in this county for 3 decades. Chief Miller, Beatrice breathed, her voice barely audible over the hum of the auditor's equipment. Arthur Miller, Elena clarified, her mind racing. The man who accepted the Citizen of the Year award last spring. The man who sat at my father's table and drank his finest scotch while planning his ruin. Beatrice looked up, a glimmer of her old spite returning. It wasn't just about the money, Elena. Your father was too honest. He had evidence of a land development kickback scheme that would have put Miller and half the city council in prison. I was just the tool they used to get inside his safe. And what did they promise you? Elena asked. The house, the status, a life built on the bones of the man you swore to love? They promised me I wouldn't go down with him, Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I was young, I was greedy, and I was terrified. Miller told me that if I didn't help them frame Thomas, they would find a way to link me to the fraud anyway. I chose myself. Wouldn't you? I chose to survive for 18 years just to see you lose everything, Elena replied coldly. There is a difference. Elena walked to the window, watching the rain start to streak the glass. History was repeating itself. A storm outside, a reckoning within. She knew that as soon as she moved against Chief Miller, she wasn't just fighting a stepmother. She was fighting a system that had spent 18 years burying its tracks. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Not to the local police, they belonged to Miller. She called a contact she had made during her time at the firm, a federal investigator named David Vance. David, it's Elena. I have the tapes, and I have a confession in progress. Elena, be careful, David's voice crackled. If Miller knows you have that footage, you aren't safe in that house. He has eyes everywhere. He's had eyes on me since I was 7, Elena said, looking at the hidden camera lens in the corner of the room. It's time he sees something he can't look away from. She hung up and turned back to Beatrice. You're going to give me a recorded statement. Every name, every bribe, every falsified document. If you do, I might be able to keep you out of a maximum security cell. If you don't, I'll make sure the world knows you were the one who suggested kicking a child out into a hurricane to clean up the loose ends. Beatrice looked at the ledger, then at the doorway where Julian stood, looking at her with utter disgust. Her husband, her wealth, her protection. It was all gone. I'll talk, Beatrice whispered, but you have to get me out of here. Miller, he'll know the moment the auditors leave. He has a scanner on the estate's frequency. He already knows, Elena said, pointing to the driveway. A lone police cruiser had pulled up to the gates. The blue and red lights weren't flashing, but the silhouette of the man inside was unmistakable. Chief Miller wasn't there to make an arrest. He was there to see how much of his world was still standing. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold fire that chased away the last of her childhood fear. She walked toward the front door. "What are you doing?" Beatrice cried out. "I'm going to go welcome him home," Elena said. "It's been 18 years since he's seen me. I'd hate to keep him waiting." As she stepped onto the porch, the cruiser's door opened. The man who stepped out was older, his hair white, but his eyes were the same ones from the tape, hard, calculating, and devoid of remorse. He adjusted his belt and looked up at the girl who had returned from the grave. The battle for the Sterling estate had just become a war for the truth. Chief Miller didn't rush. He walked with the slow, heavy gait of a man who owned the air he breathed. Every step on the gravel driveway felt like a deliberate insult to the silence of the night. He stopped at the foot of the porch stairs, looking up at Elena. The shadows of the oak trees danced across his face, making him look like a weathered statue of a forgotten god. "You have your father's eyes," Miller said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "But you have your mother's stubborn chin. I remember when you were just a slip of a thing, hiding behind the curtains while the adults talked." "I wasn't hiding, Chief," Elena replied, her voice projecting with a legal precision that seemed to catch him off guard. "I was observing. It's a habit that has served me well in the years since you helped steal my life." Miller let out a dry, short laugh. "Steal? That's a strong word for a lawyer. I recall a tragic situation where a man took risks he couldn't afford, and a wife who did what she had to do to protect herself. I was just the man who had to pick up the pieces." "You didn't pick them up. You rearranged them to fit your own puzzle," Elena said. She took one step down, closing the distance. "I've seen the tapes, Arthur. I saw you in the mudroom. I saw the way you looked at Beatrice after the door was locked. That wasn't picking up the pieces. That was a celebration." The air between them turned electric. The smug mask on Miller's face didn't slip, but his eyes narrowed. "Tapes? This house is old, Elena. Old houses play tricks on the eyes, and even if there were such things, they've been in a damp basement for 20 years. No court in this state would admit them as evidence." "Maybe not a local court," Elena countered, her smile thin and dangerous, "but I'm not interested in local justice. I've already sent digital copies to the federal prosecutor's office. They're quite interested in the civil rights violations of a minor, not to mention the conspiracy to defraud a federal estate." Miller's hand twitched toward his belt, a reflex he couldn't hide. "You're playing a very dangerous game, girl. You think a fancy degree makes you bulletproof? This is my town, my officers, my judges, my streets." "It was my father's land first," Elena said, her voice rising with a sudden, raw power. "And now it's mine. You are currently standing on private property without a warrant. You are an officer of the law in direct violation of a cease and desist order I filed against the department 2 hours ago." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, the screen glowing. "And right now, this conversation is being recorded and streamed to a secure cloud server. So, if you're planning on using that service weapon to solve your Elena problem, you should know that the world will see it before I even hit the ground." For the first time in 18 years, Arthur Miller looked unsure. He looked past her toward the house, where the auditors were visible through the windows, systematically stripping away the secrets of his empire. He saw Beatrice's shadow against the curtains, a woman he knew was a weak link, a woman who would crumble under the slightest pressure. "Your father was a dreamer, Elena," Miller said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Dreamers don't survive in the real world. They get crushed by men who understand how things actually work." "My father was a builder," Elena replied. "He built a foundation so strong that even 18 years of your lies couldn't crack it. I am the result of that foundation. And I'm not here to dream, Chief. I'm here to demolish." Miller stared at her for a long beat, his face a mask of cold fury. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back to his cruiser. The engine roared to life, and the spray of gravel as he sped away sounded like a volley of gunfire. Elena stood on the porch until the red taillights vanished into the dark. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but she didn't let her knees buckle. She turned back toward the house. "Marcus!" she shouted. The lead auditor appeared in the doorway. "Yes, Elena? Double the security. Call the private firm I hired in the city. Tell them I want a perimeter established by midnight. No one enters these gates, not even a man in a uniform, unless they have a federal badge and a signature I recognize." She walked back into the foyer, past a trembling Beatrice. Elena didn't even look at her. She went straight to the library and picked up the phone. It was time to call the one person who could help her finish this. The man who had been her father's secret ally before the end. The rising tension had reached its peak. The secrets were no longer hidden. They were screaming. And as Elena looked at the portrait of her mother over the mantel, she knew the real war was only just beginning. The phone rang 3 times before a weary, gravelly voice answered. "I told you never to call this number unless the world was ending." "The world isn't ending, Silas," Elena said, her voice cutting through the silence of the library. "But the Sterling estate is finally under new management." There was a long, sharp intake of breath on the other end. Silas Thorne had been her father's CFO, the only man who had refused to testify against Thomas, a choice that had cost him his career and sent him into a decade of self-imposed exile. "Elena?" Silas whispered. "Is it really you? I heard Beatrice had sent you to a boarding school in Europe and you decided to stay." "Beatrice lied about everything, Silas. She threw me out on the street the week after the trial. I've been gone 18 years, but I'm standing in my father's library right now, and I've found the ledger. The real one. The blue ledger." Silas's voice suddenly sounded 20 years younger. "Thomas told me he'd hidden it in the walls, but the police tore that place apart looking for it. How did you—" "He didn't hide it from the police," Elena said, looking at the biometric safe. "He hid it from the people who knew how to look. Silas, I need you. I have the evidence of the kickbacks, but I need the names of the shell companies Miller used to launder the money through the city's infrastructure projects. You're the only one who knows the codes." "It's dangerous, Elena. Miller isn't just a cop. He's the head of a shadow cabinet that has run this county since your grandfather was in diapers. If you poke that nest, they won't just sue you, they'll erase you." "They already tried," Elena said, her eyes fixed on her reflection in the dark window. "I'm already a ghost, Silas. You can't kill what's already dead. I'm at the house. There's a security detail here, and the feds are on the way. Get here by dawn." As she hung up, a crash echoed from the kitchen. Elena was moving before the sound died. She reached the hallway just as her security lead, a man named Elias, tackled a figure dressed in dark tactical gear near the servants' entrance. "Stay back, ma'am," Elias shouted. The intruder struggled, a mask slipping to reveal a young man, barely older than Elena. He wasn't a professional assassin, he was a local officer. Elena recognized the badge pinned to his belt, one of Miller's boys. "Looking for this?" Elena asked, holding up the microcassettes from the vault. The young officer spat on the floor. "You think you can come back here and ruin everything? That man built this town. He kept it safe while your father was busy playing Lord of the Manor with stolen money." "He kept it safe by making sure everyone was too afraid to speak." Elena stepped closer, her heels clicking ominously. "Tell me, officer, does the chief know you're here? Or did you come here to be a hero on your own?" The boy stayed silent, his eyes darting toward the door. "Take him to the pantry and tie him up," Elena ordered Elias. "Don't call the local precinct. We wait for the feds. If Miller wants his puppy back, he can come and explain to the FBI why he's sending officers to commit a B&E on a private residence." As they dragged the officer away, Beatrice emerged from the shadows of the dining room. She was holding a glass of scotch, her hand shaking so violently the liquid was sloshing over the rim. "He won't stop, Elena," Beatrice whimpered. "Miller, he's not like us. He doesn't care about the law. He only cares about the order. And in his order, you're an anomaly that needs to be corrected." "Then I'll be a system failure he can't reboot," Elena replied. She walked past her stepmother but stopped at the door. "By the way, Beatrice, that scotch you're drinking? It was my father's favorite. He saved it for a special occasion. I think he'd be happy to know it's finally being used to toast to your downfall." Elena went upstairs to her old bedroom. It had been converted into a sterile guest suite, but the view of the rose garden was the same. She sat on the floor, leaning against the cold glass, and opened her father's letter again. She read the last line, "Run toward the light, my brave girl." She wasn't running anymore. She was the light the blinding, unforgiving light that was about to expose every cockroach in the county. As the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, she saw a car approaching the gates. It wasn't a cruiser. It was an old, beat-up sedan. Silas was here. The final piece of the army was in place. The front door groaned as Silas Thorne stepped into the foyer. He looked like a man who had been living in a storm for 20 years. Thin, gray, and haunted. But when his eyes met Elena's, a spark of the old brilliance returned. "You look just like her," Silas whispered, looking at Elena. "Your mother. She always said you had a fire that would either warm the world or burn it down." "Right now, Silas, I'm leaning toward the latter," Elena said, ushering him into the library. They sat at the heavy oak table, the blue ledger open between them. Silas's hands trembled as he touched the pages. Thomas was a genius, Elena. He knew Miller was using the sterling construction contracts to inflate the costs of the new city reservoir. The extra millions weren't going into the pipes. They were going into a private fund called the Hearth. Miller told Thomas it was for community stability. Thomas realized it was a slush fund for political bribes. "But Beatrice said she was the one who tipped off the SEC, Elena countered. Silas shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Beatrice was the bait, Elena, but she wasn't the architect. Look at the ledger entry from June 12th, 2008. Elena leaned in. The handwriting changed. It was no longer her father's elegant script. It was a sharp, jagged hand, bold and aggressive. "Contract 402 adjusted. Sterling is becoming a liability. The girl is the leverage." "That's not my father's writing," Elena whispered. "No," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, terrified tone. "That's Julian Vane." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Julian? Beatrice's husband. But she didn't meet him until after the trial." "That's what the public record says," Silas said, pulling a yellowed photograph from his pocket. It was a picture of a local charity gala from 2006. In the background, partially obscured by a pillar, was Beatrice. She was leaning close to a man whose face was in shadow, but the distinctive gold signet ring on his hand was unmistakable. It was the same ring Julian Vane wore today. They were together the whole time, Elena realized, her stomach churning. The accidental meeting after my father's arrest was a staged play. Julian didn't marry Beatrice for love. He married her to keep the sterling assets under his control. He was Miller's silent partner. "Julian Vane is the one who launders the money," Silas explained. "Miller provides the power, Beatrice provides the access, and Julian provides the bank accounts. Your father found out, and they realized they couldn't just kill him. He was too public. So they broke him, and they used you as the hammer." Elena stood up so quickly her chair toppled over. The betrayal was deeper than she had ever imagined. Beatrice hadn't just chosen herself. She had been a puppet for a man who was still living under this roof. "Where is Julian?" Elena demanded, turning toward the door. "He's in the study, trying to call his brokers," a voice said from the doorway. It was Beatrice. She looked like a ghost, her makeup smeared, her eyes wide with a new, sharper kind of terror. "I heard everything," she whispered. "I didn't know, Elena, I swear to you. Julian told me he was helping me. He said if I helped get Thomas out of the way, we could be together. I didn't know he was working with Miller from the start." "You were just a pawn in your own game, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice devoid of pity. "He's going to kill me," Beatrice said, clutching the doorframe. "Now that you're here, now that the ledger is out, I'm the only one left who can testify to what happened in this house that night. He's in there right now, and he's not calling brokers. He's calling Miller's cleanup crew." Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered and died. The hum of the auditor's equipment cut out, leaving the mansion in a suffocating, heavy darkness. "Elias!" Elena shouted for her security lead, but the only response was the sound of a heavy door locking somewhere in the distance. The silence of the Sterling estate had always been a weapon. Now it was a trap. From the darkness of the hallway, a calm, measured voice drifted toward them. "You really should have taken the win and left, Elena," Julian Vane said. The clicking of a lighter echoed, and a small flame illuminated his face. He wasn't the panicked husband anymore. He looked like a man who had just decided to stop pretending. "You have the land, you have the house," Julian said, stepping into the library. "But you made the mistake of looking for the soul of the business. And the soul is very, very dark. The small flame of Julian's lighter danced in the dark library, casting long, grotesque shadows against the rows of law books. He looked entirely at ease, a stark contrast to the trembling Beatrice and the horrified Silas. "You know, Elena," Julian said, his voice as smooth as silk, "your father actually liked me. We spent hours right here talking about the future of the city. He thought I was his protege. He never suspected that while he was teaching me about ethics, I was teaching his wife about, let's call it, extracurricular opportunities." "You're a monster," Beatrice whispered, shrinking back. Julian didn't even look at her. "I'm a realist, Beatrice. You were a means to an end. You were the key to the vault, and once the vault was open, you became a very expensive ornament. But Elena is a problem. You have your father's flair for the dramatic, my dear. Bringing auditors, serving papers, it's all very cinematic. But law only works if there's a court left to hear it." "The feds are on their way, Julian," Elena said, her hand reaching into her pocket for her phone. "You're out of time." "Am I?" Julian stepped forward, the flame illuminating a small black device in his other hand. "This is a signal jammer, professional grade. Your cloud stream ended 5 minutes ago. Your security detail? They're currently occupied with a very convincing, albeit fake, emergency call at the back of the property. It's just us now, the family." Silas stood up, his old bones creaking. "I have the records, Julian. I have the proof of the Hearth Fund." Julian finally laughed, a cold, dry sound. "Silas, you've been living in a cabin for 10 years. You think a ledger from 2008 holds weight in a world of digital encryption? I've moved that money through 6 different countries since you last saw a bank statement. The only thing that ledger proves is that Thomas Sterling was a poor bookkeeper." "It proves intent," Elena countered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "And it proves conspiracy. You didn't just want the money, Julian. You wanted the legacy. You wanted to be the man Thomas was, but you didn't have the heart for it. So you decided to wear his life like a suit of clothes." Julian's smile vanished. The insult hit home. "I am 10 times the man Thomas was. I built an empire while he was rotting in a cell, and I'm going to keep it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, silenced pistol. The sight of it made Beatrice scream, a sharp, jagged sound that was swallowed by the heavy curtains. "The plan was simple," Julian said, leveling the gun at Elena. "A tragic house fire. The distraught daughter returns, an old electrical short in a decaying mansion, and a grieving husband loses his wife and the girl he never got to know. Miller will handle the investigation. The land trust will dissolve upon your death, and the estate will finally, legally be mine." "You won't get away with it," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the barrel of the gun. "I've been getting away with it for 18 years, Elena. What's one more night?" As Julian moved his finger toward the trigger, a loud metallic clack echoed from the corner of the room. It wasn't a gun. It was the sound of the biometric vault door swinging open again. From the darkness of the vault's interior, a mechanical whirring sound emerged. "What is that?" Julian snapped, his aim wavering. "My father knew you," Elena said, a cold realization dawning on her. "He knew someone would come back for the ledger. He didn't just install a safe, Julian. He installed a fail-safe." Suddenly, the library was flooded with light. Not from the ceiling, but from a series of high-intensity security lamps hidden behind the molding. At the same time, every speaker in the house began to blare a recording. It wasn't music, it was a conversation. "The SEC won't look at the reservoir contracts if the chief is on the board, Julian, but Thomas is getting suspicious. We need to move the Hearth funds tonight." It was Julian's voice, clear, undeniable, and it was followed by Beatrice's frantic reply. "The invisible safe," Elena whispered. "It wasn't just for ledgers. It was a voice-activated recording suite. My father didn't just document your theft, Julian. He bugged his own library." Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He turned the gun toward the vault, firing 3 muffled shots into the machinery, but the recording didn't stop. It looped, the sound of his own betrayal filling the room like a death knell. "It's over, Julian," Elena said. "The jammer only works on outgoing signals. It doesn't stop the house from talking to itself." Outside, the distant wail of sirens began to rise. Not the low local sirens of Chief Miller's cruisers, but the sharp rising and falling shriek of federal authorities. The serpent had finally been caught in its own coils. The library was a chaos of light and sound. The recorded voices of Julian and Beatrice from 2 decades ago echoed off the walls, a ghostly trial taking place in real time. Julian stood in the center of the room, his face pale and sweating, the gun trembling in his hand. He was no longer the master of the estate. He was a man trapped in a tomb of his own making. "Shut it off!" Julian screamed, firing another useless round into the ceiling. "Shut it up!" "I can't, Julian," Elena said, her voice steady even as her heart thundered. "It's a hardwired loop. My father knew that if this vault was ever forced or accessed via the emergency code under duress, it would broadcast to the entire house. And right now, every speaker in this mansion is telling the truth." Beatrice was on her knees, covering her ears, sobbing. Silas stood behind Elena, a witness to the justice he had waited 20 years to see. Suddenly, the heavy library doors burst open. It wasn't the feds, it was Chief Miller. He was alone, his uniform disheveled, his eyes wild. He took in the scene, the lights, the recording, Julian with the gun. "Julian, you idiot," Miller roared. "The feds just hit the precinct. They have warrants for the Hearth accounts. We have to go, now." Julian turned the gun toward Miller. "You told me we were safe. You told me the girl was dead or gone. You let her walk right back into my house." "It's not your house, Julian," Elena shouted over the recording. "It never was." Miller looked at Elena, and for a second the mask of the powerful chief of police dropped. He looked like a small, frightened man. He saw the recording equipment, heard his own voice discussing the reservoir kickbacks, and realized the walls weren't just ears, they were a cage. "Give me the gun, Julian," Miller said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "We can still get to the airfield. I have the keys to the evidence locker. We take what we can and we disappear." "And leave her?" Julian pointed the barrel back at Elena. "She's the one who did this. She's the one who ruined 18 years of work." "She's a witness," Miller hissed, "and witnesses can be dealt with later. But if you pull that trigger now, with those sirens 10 blocks away, you're signing your own death warrant." The tension in the room was a physical weight. Elena looked between the two men, the two architects of her father's death. They were turning on each other, the order Miller bragged about dissolving into primal survival. "You won't make it to the airfield," Elena said, stepping forward. "My security detail didn't leave, Julian. They just changed positions. They've been recording your little confession from the hallway for the last 5 minutes." Elias stepped into the light of the doorway, his own weapon drawn and leveled at Julian. "Drop it, Vane. The perimeter is sealed." Julian looked at Elias, then at Miller, and finally at Elena. The realization that he had lost, truly, finally lost, hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders slumped. The gun clattered to the hardwood floor. Miller didn't wait. He lunged for the fallen weapon, but Silas, with a burst of strength born from 2 decades of repressed rage, threw his weight against the older man. They crashed into a bookshelf, sending heavy law volumes raining down on them. Before Miller could recover, the windows of the library shattered. Flashbangs detonated in the foyer, filling the house with white light and a deafening roar. "Federal Bureau of Investigation! Hands in the air!" The room was suddenly swarming with agents in tactical gear. Elena was shoved back by an agent protecting her, but she kept her eyes on the center of the room. She watched as Julian Vane was pressed into the rug, his face ground into the fibers of the room he had stolen. She watched as Arthur Miller was handcuffed, his silver stars mocked by the cold steel of the shackles. And she watched Beatrice, who sat silent and broken, finally looking at the photograph of the 7-year-old girl that Elena had left on the desk. The recording finally cut out, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the house itself was taking its first breath in 18 years. Elena walked over to the desk. She picked up the blue ledger. Her hands were finally still. "Elena Sterling," a federal agent asked, stepping toward her. "I'm Special Agent Vance. We have the data you sent. It's more than we expected. You've brought down a kingdom tonight." "It wasn't a kingdom," Elena said, looking at the broken men being led away in the dawn light. "It was just a lie that lasted too long. But as the agents began to clear the room, Agent Vance looked at the ledger and then at Elena with a strange expression. "There's one thing, Elena. We did a preliminary scan of the Hearth funds while we were en route. There's a third signature on the offshore transfers, someone who wasn't Miller and wasn't Vane." Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the broken windows. "Who?" Vance opened a tablet and showed her a scanned document. "The transfers were authorized by a private medical facility in Switzerland. The account holder's name is listed as Sarah Sterling." Elena's world stopped. "Sarah, my mother?" "According to these records," Vance said quietly, "your mother didn't die 18 years ago. She was moved." The shocking twist hung in the air, heavier than any secret Elena had uncovered so far. The justice she had sought was just the beginning of a much darker truth. The words felt like a physical blow, more violent than any Julian could have delivered. Elena's mother, Sarah Sterling, had been the heart of her world, a heart that had supposedly stopped beating in a hospital bed 18 years ago. Elena remembered the funeral. She remembered the closed casket. She remembered the hollow ache in her father's eyes that never truly went away. "That's impossible," Elena whispered, her voice cracking for the first time since she had set foot back in this house. "I saw the death certificate. I was at the cemetery." Agent Vance looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. The death certificate was signed by a doctor who, according to our files, received a very large consultation fee from a shell company linked to Arthur Miller. And the casket— Elena, in cases of high-level fraud, a closed casket is the oldest trick in the book. Elena turned to Beatrice, who was being led toward the door by two agents. "Beatrice, look at me!" Beatrice stopped, her head hanging low. When she looked up, her eyes weren't filled with the usual fire. They were hollowed out by a long-buried guilt. "Is she alive?" Elena demanded, grabbing Beatrice's arm. "Did you know?" Beatrice let out a jagged, broken laugh. "I didn't know where she was, Elena. I swear. Miller told me she had a relapse and passed away during the night. He said it was better for Thomas to think it was quick. But then, a few years later, I saw Julian looking at bills for a clinic in the Alps. I asked him about it, and he told me to never ask again if I wanted to keep my life." She leaned in, her voice a ghostly rasp. "Your father didn't just have evidence of money, Elena. He had evidence of you. Your mother was the leverage they used to make Thomas plead guilty. They told him that if he went to prison quietly, they would keep her in the best facility money could buy. If he fought them, she'd be disconnected the next morning." The room seemed to spin. Her father hadn't been a victim of his own weakness. He had been a martyr for her mother's life. He had spent his final years in a cell knowing his wife was a prisoner in a golden cage, all to keep his daughter safe from the same wolves. "Where is she now?" Elena asked, her voice cold as a tombstone. "The account was closed 3 months ago," Vance said, checking his tablet, "following a transfer request to a private residence in this state. It seems someone brought her home." Elena's head snapped toward Silas. The old man was leaning against the bookshelf, his face buried in his hands. "Silas?" Elena asked softly. The old CFO looked up, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I couldn't tell you, Elena. I promised Thomas. I've been taking care of her in secret. After Julian stopped paying the bills to bury the trail, I used the last of my own savings to bring her back. She's not the woman you remember. The illness, the years of isolation, she's a shadow." "Where is she?" "The gardener's cottage," Silas whispered. "At the edge of the estate. I've been living there, acting as her nurse." Elena didn't wait for the feds or the auditors. She ran. She burst through the library doors, down the porch steps, and across the wet grass. The rain had turned to a light mist, clinging to her hair like cobwebs. She ran past the main house, past the fountain where she used to play, toward the small stone cottage tucked behind the overgrown hedges. She reached the door and stopped. Her hand hovered over the wood. For 18 years, she had been fueled by a desire for justice, for a father who was gone and a life that was stolen. Now the truth was on the other side of this door, and she was terrified. She pushed it open. The cottage was small and smelled of lavender and antiseptic. In the corner, by a window overlooking the rose garden, sat a woman in a wheelchair. Her hair was white and her skin was like translucent parchment. But as she turned her head, Elena saw the eyes. Her eyes. "Elena," the woman whispered, her voice like the rustle of dried leaves. Elena fell to her knees at her mother's feet, the charcoal suit she had worn as armor finally feeling like a burden. She took her mother's hands, thin, cold, but real. "I'm here, Mama," Elena sobbed, the lawyer, the hunter, and the ghost all vanishing. "I'm home." "I knew you'd come," Sarah said, a small, fragile smile touching her lips. "Your father told me. He said our girl would be the one to turn the lights back on." As the sun began to break through the clouds over the Sterling estate, the light didn't just expose the crimes of the past. It illuminated the path to a future that Elena had never dared to imagine. The war was over. The house was hers. And for the first time in 18 years, the Sterling family wasn't just a memory. It was a heartbeat. The trial of the decade didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the headlines. With the blue ledger, the secret recordings, and Sarah Sterling's testimony, the empire of Arthur Miller and Julian Vane collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Miller was stripped of his rank and sentenced to life without parole for a litany of federal crimes. Julian, the man who tried to wear a dead man's life, found himself in a cold cell, penniless and forgotten. Beatrice received a reduced sentence in exchange for her full cooperation, but her true punishment was the public shame. She left the state, a woman whose name became synonymous with the betrayal of a child. 6 months later, the Sterling estate looked different. The iron gates were gone, replaced by an open driveway lined with white hydrangeas. The no trespassing signs had been burned in a celebratory bonfire. Elena sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and violet. She wasn't wearing a charcoal suit today. She was wearing a simple linen dress, her feet bare on the warm wood. Inside, she could hear the soft sound of a piano. Her mother, Sarah, was practicing. Her strength was returning slowly, but her spirit was whole. Silas Thorne had stayed on as the estate manager, finally able to walk the grounds with his head held high. He walked up the stairs now, carrying a tray of tea. "The foundation for the Thomas Sterling Youth Center was poured this morning," Silas said, a genuine smile on his face. "The old reservoir land is officially being converted into a public park. The city is calling it Elena's Reach." "It should be called Thomas's Truth," Elena replied, taking a cup. "He's the one who held the line." "He held the line so you could cross it, Elena," Silas said softly. Elena looked out at the rose garden. The bushes she had remembered as a child had been revitalized. They were blooming in a riot of red and pink, a living testament to the fact that beauty can grow even in soil that was once poisoned. She thought about the night 18 years ago, the cold rain, the plastic bag, the feeling of being discarded. For a long time, she thought that night defined her. She thought she was the girl who was kicked out. But as she watched her mother walk out onto the porch, leaning lightly on a cane but standing tall, Elena realized she was something else entirely. She was the woman who came back. She was the proof that justice isn't just about punishing the wicked. It's about reclaiming what was lost. "What are you thinking about, Elena?" Sarah asked, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Elena looked at her mother, then at the sprawling, beautiful estate that was finally a home again. She thought about the journey from a bus station bench to the head of a legacy. "I was thinking about the story people will tell about this house," Elena said. "For a long time, it was a ghost story, a story of betrayal and secrets. And now?" Elena smiled, a warm, bright expression that reached her eyes. "Now it's a story about the light. It took 18 years to get here, Mama, but the morning is finally here." She stood up and looked at the horizon. The Sterling name was no longer a headline for a scandal. It was a beacon for the town. Elena had sued her own family, yes, but in doing so, she had saved its soul. As the first stars began to twinkle over the garden, Elena Sterling finally closed her briefcase for the day. The debt was paid. The truth was out. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't looking back at the shadows. She was looking forward to the rest of the story.